It was Tuesday, March 14th, around 8:30 in the evening, when everything changed in my living room in Cedar Falls. My son-in-law Marcus stood there, 6 feet from my worn leather armchair, the same chair I'd sat in every night for 30 years, the one my late wife Sarah picked out at that little furniture store back in '94. He pointed his finger right at my chest, his voice getting louder with each word, telling my daughter Jennifer that I was dragging them down financially, and that it was time I moved into a more suitable living arrangement for someone my age. Those were his exact words, and I'll never forget them. He said them like I wasn't even in the room, like I was a piece of furniture they needed to donate to Goodwill. Jennifer just stood there by the fireplace, the one I'd rebuilt with my own hands when she was 7 years old, and she didn't say a word. Not one word in my defense. Marcus kept going, talking about how they needed to liquidate assets and restructure their portfolio, throwing around these fancy finance terms he'd learned from his podcasts. He said my house, the house I'd paid off in 2003 after working double shifts at the manufacturing plant for 15 years, was underutilized real estate that could generate better returns. I remember looking at Jennifer, searching her face for something, anything, that looked like the little girl I'd raised, the one I'd walk to school every morning, the one whose college loans I'd co-signed even when the bank told me I was too old to take on that kind of debt. But what really broke something inside me wasn't the financial talk or even the disrespect, though God knows there was plenty of that. It was when Marcus stepped closer, lowered his voice to that condescending tone people use when they think you're not smart enough to understand, and said, "Robert, you're 62 years old. You don't understand how the modern world works anymore. It's time to let the people who actually know what they're doing make the decisions." He actually patted me on the shoulder when he said it, like I was a confused child who needed reassurance. And Jennifer, my Jennifer, she just nodded along, like everything coming out of his mouth made perfect sense, like I hadn't spent 40 years making decisions that kept a roof over our heads and food on the table. That was the moment he thought I was finished. That was the moment they both thought the old man would just shuffle off quietly, sign whatever papers they put in front of him, and disappear into whatever suitable arrangement they had planned. And that's when I decided something important, something that would change everything. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't beg my own daughter to remember who I was or what I'd done for her. No, I would end it quietly, the same way I'd built everything in my life, carefully, patiently, with a foundation so solid that when it was time to make my move, there'd be no question about who was still standing. Family revenge isn't about screaming matches or slamming doors. It's about knowing exactly when to let people dig their own graves. See? Marcus made a critical mistake that night in my living room, surrounded by the photos of Jennifer's childhood that still hung on my walls, under the ceiling fan I'd installed myself in the summer of 2001. He assumed that because I wore the same flannel shirts I'd worn for 20 years, because I didn't talk about cryptocurrency or real estate investments at family dinners, that I was simple, outdated, someone who'd let the world pass him by. But here's what people like Marcus never understand about men like me. We're not loud because we don't need to be. We built things before everyone had an opinion about everything. And when you've spent 6 decades watching people come and go, when you've buried a wife and raised a daughter and survived things that would break most people, you learn something valuable. You learn that the quietest moves are always the most devastating. Look, I'm sharing this with you because I know I'm not the only one. If you're watching this right now and you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever been made to feel like your years of sacrifice don't matter anymore because you're not relevant to the new generation's plans, then you understand exactly where I was that Tuesday night. Maybe you've got a son-in-law like Marcus, or a daughter-in-law, or even your own kids who've forgotten that the comfortable life they're living didn't just appear out of thin air. Maybe you've been sitting at a dinner table, listening to people half your age tell you how the world works while they live in a house you helped pay for. If any of that sounds familiar, I need you to stay with me, because what happened over the next 6 months wasn't just about me. It was about every parent who's been treated like an expired product that needs to be replaced. I'm Robert Mitchell, 62 years old, born and raised right here in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I worked at Hendrickson Manufacturing for 41 years, starting on the floor when I was 21 and working my way up to shift supervisor by the time I was 35. My hands aren't smooth like Marcus's. They've got scars from machinery, calluses from honest work, and they shake a little bit now when it gets cold. My late wife Sarah used to joke that these hands built everything we had, and she wasn't wrong. These hands rebuilt our transmission in the driveway in '98 when we couldn't afford a mechanic. These hands painted every room in Jennifer's childhood home. These hands signed the check for $47,000 in 2009 to cover her last 2 years at the University of Northern Iowa when her scholarships ran out. Family betrayal isn't something you see coming when you're busy building someone's future. Now, before we go any further into this story, I want you to do something for me. Hit that like button if you've ever given everything to someone and watched them turn around and treat you like you're the problem. I'm serious. Not for me, but because I want every person watching this to know they're not alone in feeling what they're feeling right now. And listen, subscribe to this channel, because by the end of this story, you're going to see something that changed my entire perspective on family, loyalty, and what happens when people mistake your kindness for weakness. You're going to see why revenge stories don't always need raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, the quietest moves are the ones that change everything. Here's what I want you to think about. And I really want you to answer this in the comments because your story matters just as much as mine. Have you ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for? Have you ever looked at your own child and wondered when they stopped seeing you as their parent and started seeing you as an obstacle? Because that's exactly what happened to me on March 14th. And honestly, it had been building for 2 years before that. Ever since Marcus came into the picture with his business degree from some online university and his ideas about maximizing potential and cutting dead weight, I'd been feeling it. The way he'd sigh when I told stories about the old days. The way he'd check his phone when I was talking. The way he'd refer to me as Jen's dad instead of by my name, like I was just a role, not a person. Jennifer met Marcus at a real estate seminar in Des Moines back in January 2022. She was 33, working as an elementary school teacher at Lincoln Elementary, the same school she'd attended as a kid, teaching in the same building where I used to pick her up every day at 3:15. Marcus was the guest speaker, talking about property investments and building wealth, and I guess she was impressed by the suit and the confidence. They were married 8 months later in a ceremony I paid $18,000 for, even though my pension barely covered my own expenses. I did it because that's what fathers do. You give everything you have to see your daughter smile on her wedding day. I didn't know then that I was funding the beginning of my own erasure, that family revenge would become something I'd have to learn instead of something I'd ever imagined doing. Let me tell you who I was before all of this happened, because it matters. I started working at Hendrickson Manufacturing 3 days after my 21st birthday in August 1984. My father got me the interview, told me to show up 15 minutes early, shake hands firmly, and look the foreman in the eye. I did exactly that, and I got hired on the spot to work the assembly line making truck suspensions. The pay was $8.50 an hour, which felt like a fortune back then. I worked that line for 14 years, every single day, through summers when the factory floor hit 95 degrees and winters when the heating barely worked. I never called in sick unless I was actually sick, never complained about overtime, never caused problems. By 1998, they promoted me to shift supervisor, and I held that position until I retired in 2023 at 61, with a pension that covers my basics and not much else. Sarah and I got married in 1986 at Cedar Falls Methodist Church, the same church where her parents got married 30 years before. We had Jennifer in 1989, and I'll never forget holding that tiny little girl in the hospital, thinking about all the things I wanted to give her that I never had growing up. We weren't rich. Sarah worked part-time at the public library, and between the two of us, we made enough to buy our small 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Drive for $89,000 in 1991. That house became everything to us. I painted Jennifer's room pink when she turned 5 because that was her favorite color. I built her a treehouse in the backyard oak tree when she was 8. Spent 3 weekends getting it just right. Every birthday, every Christmas, every school event. We were there, always, because that's what parents do when they actually care about building something real. Then in 2007, everything changed. Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in March, and by November, she was gone. Jennifer was only 18, just started her freshman year at UNI. And suddenly, it was just the two of us. I'll be honest with you, those next few years nearly broke me. I'd come home from 10-hour shifts at the plant to an empty house that still smelled like Sarah's lavender lotion, and I'd sit in that leather chair and wonder how I was supposed to do this alone. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart, because Jennifer needed me. Her scholarships covered tuition, but not books, not housing, not food, not any of the 1,000 other expenses that come with college. So I picked up every overtime shift they'd give me. I worked weekends. I worked holidays. In 2009, when her scholarships ran out and she still had 2 years to go, I took out a second mortgage on the house, $47,000 at 7.2% interest, to make sure she could finish. I never told Jennifer about the second mortgage. Never told her about the times I ate ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week so I could send her an extra $100 for textbooks. Never told her that I canceled the cable TV and kept my thermostat at 62 degrees all winter to save money. That's not what fathers do. We don't keep score. We don't send invoices. We don't make our kids feel guilty for needing things. We just handle it quietly and hope that someday they'll understand what it cost. When Jennifer graduated in 2011 with her teaching degree, I sat in that arena at the Uni Dome with tears running down my face, thinking about how proud Sarah would have been. I thought about all those overtime shifts, all those sacrifices, and I felt like it was all worth it because my daughter made it, despite losing her mother, despite everything. After graduation, Jennifer moved back to Cedar Falls and got hired at Lincoln Elementary teaching 3rd grade. She lived with me for 2 years while she saved money, and those were good years, I'm not going to lie. We'd have dinner together most nights, watch Jeopardy, talk about her students and my day at the plant. In 2015, she told me she wanted to buy her own place, a little townhouse on the west side of town, listed at $165,000. She'd saved $12,000, but the bank wanted 20% down plus closing costs. So I wrote her a check for $28,000, everything I had left in my savings after Sarah's medical bills and funeral expenses. I told her it was a gift, not a loan, because that's what it was. I wanted her to have her own space, her own life, her own independence. I never imagined that 10 years later, that same daughter would stand in my living room and let her husband talk about me like I was dead weight that needed to be cut loose. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, until one day you realize you've become a stranger in the life you built. Marcus Sullivan walked into Jennifer's life in January 2022 at the Riverside Convention Center in Des Moines, during a weekend real estate investment seminar that cost $300 to attend. She'd told me she was going with her friend Amy from work. Said they wanted to learn about building wealth and making smarter financial decisions. I thought it was great. My daughter wanting to secure her future, wanting to learn about investments and property. What I didn't know was that the guest speaker, a 36-year-old guy with slicked back hair and a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension, would become the person who'd eventually try to erase me from my own life. Marcus grew up in West Des Moines, went to some online business school called Summit University, and worked as a financial consultant for a firm that helped people flip houses and manage rental properties. At least, that's what he told everyone. Jennifer came home that Sunday evening talking nonstop about this brilliant speaker who'd explained passive income and property portfolios and generational wealth. She showed me his business card, Marcus Sullivan, wealth strategy consultant, printed on thick cardstock with gold. Let this look in her eyes I hadn't seen since high school. That excited energy, when something new captures your attention completely. Within 2 weeks, they were having coffee. Within a month, he was picking her up for dinner in his leased BMW 5 Series, the kind of car that screams, "I need you to think I'm successful." I met him for the first time in February when he came to pick Jennifer up, and I'll never forget that handshake. Too firm, too long, looking right past me while he talked about the weather like I was the doorman instead of her father. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but you know how it is when your kid's happy. You ignore the little things because you don't want to be the parent who ruins everything. Marcus had this way of talking where every conversation became a lecture about money, investments, or what he called financial literacy. He'd sit at my dinner table, eating the pot roast I'd spent 3 hours making, and tell Jennifer that people from older generations don't understand modern wealth-building strategies. He'd use phrases like diversified income streams and leveraging assets and optimizing cash flow, while looking at my modest home like it was a museum exhibit of everything wrong with working-class thinking. He never asked me about my life, never showed interest in the 41 years I'd spent actually working for a living. To Marcus, I was just Jennifer's dad, the old guy who didn't get it, who'd spent his whole life trading time for money instead of making money work for him. They got engaged in June 2022 after only 5 months of dating. Marcus proposed at some fancy restaurant in downtown Des Moines, got down on one knee with a ring that Jennifer later told me cost $8,000. $8,000 for a ring. And this guy was driving a leased car and renting a condo. But what did I know? I was just the old man who didn't understand modern finance. The wedding was set for September 24, 2022, and that's when the pressure really started. Marcus had ideas about the wedding, wanted it at the Waterfront Convention Center, wanted a band that cost $4,000, wanted an open bar and a 7-course meal for 150 guests. The initial quote came back at $32,000. And when Jennifer came to me with tears in her eyes saying they couldn't afford it, I did what I always did. I said yes. I took $18,000 from my retirement account, paid the early withdrawal penalty, and covered more than half the wedding costs because I couldn't stand seeing my daughter disappointed on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Marcus never said thank you. Not once. At the wedding, during his speech, he thanked everyone, his parents, his business partners, his college roommate, but when it came to me, he just said, "And of course, Jen's dad Robert," like I was an afterthought. Like I hadn't just depleted my retirement to make his perfect day happen. That night, standing in the back of that reception hall watching Jennifer dance with this man who couldn't even acknowledge what I'd done, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger yet, more like a quiet recognition that I'd just funded my own replacement. That family betrayal often starts with good intentions and ends with you wondering when you became invisible. Marcus moved into Jennifer's townhouse after the honeymoon, and within 3 months, he started talking about how they needed to upgrade their living situation and how my house on Sycamore Drive was sitting on untapped equity that could be better utilized. That's when I knew this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control, and I was the obstacle standing in his way. It happened on March 14th, 2024, a Tuesday evening around 8:30, and I remember every single detail like it's burned into my memory. Marcus and Jennifer had called earlier that day saying they wanted to come over to discuss something important, and I'd assumed it was about Easter plans or maybe Jennifer's birthday coming up in April. I'd made coffee, set out some of Sarah's old china cups that Jennifer used to love, even put out some cookies from the bakery downtown. They arrived 20 minutes late, and Marcus walked in carrying this leather portfolio folder, the expensive kind that screams, "I'm about to present you with something official." Jennifer looked nervous, wouldn't quite meet my eyes, kept fidgeting with her wedding ring. I offered them coffee, and Marcus waved it off like I'd offered him poison, said, "We need to keep this quick, Robert. We've got another appointment at 9. He sat down on my couch, opened that portfolio, and started pulling out documents. Pages and pages of legal-looking papers with highlighted sections and sticky note tabs. He didn't ease into it, didn't ask how I was doing, just launched right in with, "So Robert, Jennifer and I have been doing a comprehensive financial analysis of our family situation, and we've identified some significant concerns that need to be addressed immediately. Family situation." Like I was a line item on a spreadsheet instead of the man who raised the woman sitting next to him. He started talking about my house, how it was valued at approximately $285,000 according to recent comps, how my property taxes were increasing, how maintenance costs on a house this old were financially irresponsible, for someone on a fixed income. Jennifer just sat there, staring at her hands, and I kept waiting for her to tell him to slow down, to stop talking to me like I was incompetent, but she didn't say a word. Then Marcus slid a document across my coffee table, and I'll never forget what it said at the top. Power of attorney and property transfer agreement. He explained, in that condescending tone he'd perfected over the past 2 years, that they'd found a really nice assisted living facility in Waterloo called Meadowbrook Senior Community, that it had activities and nurses on staff, and I'd be around people my own age. He said they'd handle selling my house, that the equity would cover the facility costs for a few years, and that this way I wouldn't have to burden myself with yard work, repairs, or property management anymore. I looked at Jennifer, really looked at her, and said, "Jen, sweetheart, is this what you want? You want me to leave the house where you grew up, where your mother and I built our whole life?" And she finally met my eyes. And what she said broke something inside me that I don't think ever fully healed. She said, "Dad, we're just trying to help. You're not getting any younger, and we worry about you being alone out here." That's when Marcus made his fatal mistake. He stood up, walked over to where I was sitting in my leather chair, Sarah's chair, the one that held 40 years of memories, and he pointed his finger right at my chest. Not touching me, but close enough that I could smell his cologne, some expensive brand that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. His voice got louder, sharper, and he said, "Robert, you need to understand something. This isn't a negotiation. Jennifer is our primary concern now, and frankly, you're dragging us down financially and emotionally. Every dollar we spend helping you is a dollar we can't invest in our future, in our children when we have them. You're 62 years old. You don't understand how the modern world works anymore, and it's time to let the people who actually know what they're doing make the decisions." Then he did it. He actually patted me on the shoulder, twice, like I was a confused dog that needed reassurance, and said, "It's time to let go, Pops. Sign the papers." The room went completely silent. I looked at Jennifer, waiting for her to defend me, to tell her husband that he'd just crossed every line a person can cross when speaking to their father-in-law. But she didn't. Instead, she touched Marcus's arm gently and said, "Honey, maybe we should give Dad some time to think about it." But there was no conviction in her voice, no anger at how he'd just spoken to me. Marcus sat back down, closed his portfolio, and said, "You've got until Friday to sign, Robert. After that, we'll need to explore other options. And trust me, you won't like those options as much as this one." They left 5 minutes later, and I sat in that chair for 3 hours, not moving, not crying, just feeling something fundamental shift inside me. That's when I understood what family betrayal really means. It's not a sudden knife in the back. It's watching someone you built from nothing stand by while someone else tries to demolish everything you are. And that's when I decided that revenge stories aren't always about getting even. Sometimes they're about teaching people that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. After they left that Tuesday night, I didn't call Jennifer. I didn't text. I didn't show up at their door demanding an apology or an explanation. I didn't do any of the things Marcus probably expected an angry old man to do. Instead, I sat in my chair until almost midnight, and then I got up, made myself a cup of tea, and started thinking clearly for the first time in 2 years. See, people like Marcus make a fundamental miscalculation when they deal with people like me. They think silence means defeat, that when you don't fight back immediately, it's because you can't. They mistake patience for weakness, quiet for confusion, and stillness for surrender. But I learned a long time ago, back in my days as shift supervisor managing 23 workers on the factory floor, that the most powerful move you can make is often no move at all. Let them think they've won. Let them get comfortable. Let them stop watching their backs. For the next 3 days, I went about my normal routine like nothing had happened. I mowed my lawn on Wednesday morning. I went to the hardware store and bought new filters for my furnace. I had coffee with my neighbor Dale Peterson like I did every Thursday at Muggsy's Diner on Main Street. Jennifer called me on Thursday afternoon, her voice careful and quiet, asking if I was okay, if I'd thought about what they'd discussed. I told her I was fine. that I needed some time to review the papers, that I'd let them know by the weekend. She sounded relieved, probably reported back to Marcus that the old man was coming around, that their plan was working. What Jennifer didn't know, what Marcus certainly didn't know, was that her father wasn't some confused senior citizen who'd spent 40 years mindlessly working a factory job without understanding how the world actually operates. They'd made assumptions based on my flannel shirts and my old truck and my simple life, and that was their first mistake. Here's what Marcus never bothered to learn about me during those 2 years of family dinners and condescending lectures about financial literacy. Before I became a shift supervisor, before I spent 4 decades on the factory floor, I'd done other things. In my 20s, I'd taken night classes at Hawkeye Community College studying business management and contract law because I wanted to understand the paperwork I was signing, wanted to know my rights as a worker and a property owner. I'd served on the union negotiation committee for 12 years, sat across tables from corporate lawyers and plant managers, learned how to read between the lines of legal documents and spot the traps hidden in friendly language. I'd helped 3 different co-workers navigate disability claims, pension disputes, and wrongful termination cases. I knew people, good people who owed me favors, who remembered when I'd helped them and who'd told me years ago, "Robert, if you ever need anything, you call me." Marcus looked at me and saw an obsolete old man, but what he should have seen was someone who'd spent 62 years building relationships, understanding systems, and learning that real power doesn't announce itself with expensive suits and fancy cars. On Friday morning, I made a phone call to Thomas Chen, a lawyer who'd worked at Hendrickson's legal department back in the 90s before starting his own practice in Cedar Falls. Tom and I had history. I'd been the supervisor who'd fought to keep him on the insurance plan when he was going through cancer treatment in 2003, when the company wanted to classify him as a contractor to avoid the costs. He'd told me back then that he'd never forget what I'd done. And I'd told him that's just what decent people do. We met for lunch at Riley's Steakhouse, and I showed him the power of attorney documents Marcus had given me. Tom studied them for maybe 10 minutes, and then he looked up at me with this expression I'll never forget. Part anger, part respect, part something that looked like anticipation. He said, "Robert, do you understand what you almost signed here? This doesn't just give them power of attorney. It includes clauses that would have transferred your property deed, given them access to your pension, and essentially made you financially dependent on their decisions for the rest of your life." That's when I knew. This wasn't just about Marcus wanting to help an aging father-in-law. This was about control, about assets, about family revenge in reverse where the person who'd sacrificed everything becomes the target. And that's when I told Tom exactly what I needed him to do. On Sunday to March 24th, exactly 10 days after that confrontation in my living room, I called Jennifer and invited them both to dinner at my house. She sounded surprised, maybe even relieved, and said, "Dad, does this mean you've thought about what we discussed? About the papers?" I told her we could talk about everything over a meal, that I wanted to do this right, as a family. She agreed immediately, probably thinking the old man had finally seen reason and was ready to surrender. I spent that Saturday preparing, made my famous slow-cooked pot roast with carrots and potatoes, baked an apple pie from scratch using Sarah's handwritten recipe card that still had her fingerprints on it from 1995, set the dining room table with the good china we only used on holidays. I wanted everything to feel normal, comfortable, safe. Because the thing about catching someone off guard is that they need to believe they've already won, that there's nothing left to worry about, that the threat has passed, and they can finally relax. They arrived at 6 o'clock on Sunday evening, and Marcus walked in like he owned the place, already mentally spending the equity from my house. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt, more casual than I'd ever seen him, which told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't worried anymore, wasn't on guard, had probably already started looking at bigger properties for him and Jennifer to buy once they liquidated my underutilized asset. Jennifer hugged me, asked if I needed help in the kitchen, and I could see the guilt in her eyes mixing with relief that this was all going to be settled peacefully. We sat down to eat, and for the first 20 minutes, it was almost like old times, passing dishes, talking about Jennifer's students at Lincoln Elementary, Marcus telling some story about a property deal he'd closed. I was patient, cordial, asked questions, laughed at appropriate moments. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him arrogant. I wanted him completely unprotected when the floor dropped out from under him. After dinner, I brought out the apple pie and coffee, and that's when Marcus said, "So, Robert, have you had a chance to review those documents? We really need to get this moving. I've already put a deposit down on a spot at Meadowbrook, and the real estate agent is ready to list your house the moment you sign." He pulled out that same leather portfolio, slid the papers across my dining room table with a pen, and sat back with this satisfied smile like a man who just closed the easiest deal of his life. Jennifer was quiet, not quite looking at me, and I could see she'd already made peace with this in her mind, had already convinced herself this was the right thing to do. That's when I reached into my own folder, a simple manila one, nothing fancy, and pulled out a different set of documents. I slid them across the table and said, "Marcus, before I sign anything, I think you should take a look at these. They're the results of a title search and financial audit that my attorney Thomas Chen conducted over the past week." Marcus's face went from confident to confused in about 3 seconds. He picked up the first document, started reading, and I watched the color drain from his cheeks as he realized what he was looking at. The title search showed that my house had a primary lien holder, me, with a clear deed going back to 2003, but it also showed that Marcus had somehow filed a preliminary claim against the property 6 weeks earlier, February 1st, using forged documents that claimed I'd agreed to a reverse mortgage through his company. The second document was even better. Bank records showing that Marcus's investment firm was actually operating on a revoked business license, that he'd been investigated twice for financial fraud in Polk County, and that 3 of his previous clients had filed complaints about predatory lending practices. The third document was a legal letter from Tom Chen's office explaining that the power of attorney papers Marcus had presented were legally invalid because they'd been drafted to benefit Marcus directly, which violates Iowa state law regarding fiduciary responsibility. And the final document was a notarized statement I'd signed 3 days earlier, officially reporting Marcus's attempted fraud to the Iowa Attorney General's office. I looked at Marcus, who was now sweating through his polo shirt, and said, "See, Marcus, you made one critical mistake. You assumed that because I worked with my hands my whole life, I didn't know how to use my head. You assumed that family betrayal would be easy because the old man wouldn't fight back. But revenge stories aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just about letting someone hang themselves with their own rope. And you've been tying that knot for 2 years. Marcus stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over backward. His hands were shaking as he shuffled through the documents again. Like maybe he'd misread them the first time. Like maybe there was some way out of this that his brain just hadn't calculated yet. Jennifer grabbed his arm and said, "Marcus, what is this? What does he mean you filed a claim against Dad's house? You told me you were just helping with estate planning." And that's when I saw it happen. The exact moment my daughter realized she'd married a con artist who'd been using her to get to me, to get to my property, to get to whatever assets he could extract before moving on to his next target. Marcus tried to salvage it, started talking fast about misunderstandings and paperwork errors, and how his business license issue was just a bureaucratic mix-up. But his voice had that desperate edge that people get when the walls are closing in. I didn't raise my voice, didn't gloat, didn't do any of the dramatic things you see in movies. I just sat there calmly and said, "Marcus, you tried to steal my house using fraudulent documents. You manipulated my daughter into believing I was incompetent so you could control my assets. And you did it all while eating meals at my table and calling me Pops. This wasn't revenge. This was accountability." The next part happened fast. Marcus grabbed his portfolio, told Jennifer they were leaving immediately, tried to spin some story about how I'd clearly lost my mind and was making up conspiracy theories. But Jennifer wasn't moving. She was staring at those documents, reading the bank records and complaint filings, and I could see 33 years of trust crumbling in real time. She looked at Marcus and said, "Is any of this true? Did you really try to file a claim on my father's house without telling me?" He made the fatal mistake of lying one more time, said, "Baby, you know your dad's been confused lately. This is exactly why we need to get him help." And that's when Jennifer's face changed completely. She turned to me with tears streaming down her cheeks and said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't defend you. I'm so sorry I let him talk to you that way." Marcus tried to grab her arm, told her they needed to leave and discuss this privately, but she pulled away from him like his touch burned. Within 10 minutes, Marcus was gone, peeling out of my driveway in his leased BMW, leaving Jennifer standing in my living room crying harder than I'd seen since Sarah's funeral. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Jennifer moved back into her old room at my house temporarily, while she filed for divorce and sorted out the financial mess Marcus had created in their 2 years of marriage. We didn't talk much at first. She was dealing with shame and betrayal, and the realization that she'd chosen a man over her father, that she'd stood by while someone tried to destroy the person who'd sacrificed everything for her. But slowly, over late-night cups of tea at my kitchen table, we started rebuilding what had been broken. She told me she'd gotten so caught up in Marcus's vision of wealth and success that she'd forgotten what real security looked like. Not expensive cars and investment portfolios, but a paid-off house, honest work, and a father who'd never once asked for anything in return. The Iowa Attorney General's office moved forward with fraud charges against Marcus in May, and by July, his business license was permanently revoked, and he'd left the state entirely, probably looking for new people to manipulate in some other town where nobody knew his history. What's left now is something I didn't expect. Peace, real peace. Not the fake kind you convince yourself you have when you're tolerating disrespect for the sake of family harmony. My house on Sycamore Drive is still mine, paid off and quiet, filled with memories of Sarah and the better years with Jennifer. I still sit in my leather chair every evening, still drink my coffee on the front porch every morning, still drive my 2008 Ford pickup with 192,000 miles on it now. But something's different. I'm not carrying that weight anymore. That feeling of being invisible in my own life, of watching people I loved treat me like I didn't matter. See, family revenge isn't really about revenge at all when you break it down. It's about refusing to set yourself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't even bring you water when you're burning. It's about understanding that love without boundaries becomes exploitation, that kindness without limits gets mistaken for weakness, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. I learned that silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And I learned that the quietest moves, the ones nobody sees coming, are always the most powerful because they're built on patience, preparation, and the kind of foundation that takes 62 years to build. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this, and I mean this with everything I've learned in 62 years of living. Never set yourself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't even bring you water when you're burning. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between your dignity and keeping the peace, hit that like button right now. Not for me, but for every person watching who needs to know they're not wrong for setting boundaries with people they love. Subscribe to this channel because I'm going to keep sharing these stories, these moments of truth where good people finally stand up and take back what's theirs, where family betrayal gets answered not with violence but with accountability and justice. And here's what I really want to know. Drop it in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved to protect your dignity? Have you ever been forced to choose between being respected and being used? Tell me your story, because I guarantee someone else watching needs to hear it, needs to know they're not alone in feeling what they're feeling right now. Turn on those notifications. Stay with us for more revenge stories that prove silence isn't weakness, it's just strategy. And sometimes the quietest people make the loudest impact when they finally decide enough is enough.